To talk about these legislative actions to break the seal of confession from a legal and religious liberty perspective, we're joined by attorney Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. She's the director of the Conscience Project and a fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. Andrea, it's so great to have you here with us. How do bills breaking the seal of confession violate First Amendment rights, and why is this so important to the church?
Well, Montse, first, thank you so much for inviting me on. This is a really important issue that I'm glad all of your viewers are paying attention to. First off, you mentioned it. These are laws that are targeting religious activity. And just by targeting religious activity for disfavored treatment, they come into problems with the First Amendment. It's worth noting that other privileges, like the attorney-client privilege, remain in those jurisdictions. So we can see that this is directed towards something that is protected under the First Amendment as religious behavior and activity that needs to be treated fairly and on the same footing as other activity like the conversations between a lawyer and their client. The second is it brings the government into an important aspect of our faith, and that's the sacrament of confession. We've already seen from the Supreme Court recognition of what we call the ministerial exception. And that means that the government can't get into and looking at second-guessing hiring decisions that we make for teachers and other ministers within our churches. And there's nothing more intimate to our inner workings as how we run our worship and our sacraments. So that's another issue that I think is an affront to the First Amendment in the attempt to repeal this privilege that's existed for such a long time in all 50 states.
Now, Andrea, how is the church unique in this sacrament? This targets the sacramental life specifically, but does it target it in such a way that other faiths are not being placed under scrutiny for? Abuse in other communities is also prevalent, and it's not just the Catholic Church. Is this something that ignores those differences across faiths and only targets the Catholic Church?
You know, I think, Montse, that's a really interesting question. First, as you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation of this issue, priests are required outside of the confessional, both by their diocese and oftentimes in jurisdictions, to share information that they find. And members of our church community are considered mandatory reporters, along with pediatricians, teachers, coaches. That's a really important thing to make clear. So when we're saying that we're pushing against these attempts to kind of lift the seal of confession, it doesn't mean that Catholics aren't serious about child abuse. But there is an important and unique position that Catholics have related to the confession, the confessional, and the secrecy and the anonymity of the sacrament of confession. Some faith traditions share similar confidentiality, and when we look at privileges in different jurisdictions, they list priests and other ministers. But it does seem like, especially in these locations, they're targeting the Catholic Church specifically. And it's a desire to address our terrible history of child abuse, but it's getting at the wrong root problem. And attacking the confessional and the seal of confession, in my opinion, won't root out abuse, but can almost keep it in the dark.
Now, Andrea, that's true. The painful story of the scandals that continue to break in our church is real, and we're living through it as Catholics. But other states have successfully passed various versions of laws that target the seal of confession. North Carolina, New Hampshire, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Texas among them. How did those measures get through those legislatures, and how are they being applied?
You know, it's very interesting that you raised those. I haven't seen cases where priests were forced to divulge what was said in confession in those jurisdictions. So I think it's probably one of those cases of scoring political points by attacking the church, but finding that in practice, it's not a helpful or useful thing for local law enforcement to try to effectively put a cop in the confessional.
And is it possible that we'll see a challenge over these laws in federal courts or possibly at the Supreme Court?
I think that we've heard from our church leaders in those jurisdictions that if they're pressed, not only first is it not going to be effective because priests will not violate the seal, but if there are fines or there are other kinds of threats against individual priests or the diocese, the church is ready to stand and defend religious freedom, church autonomy. And what I really hope would be avoided in all of this is that in trying to address child abuse, we're not pitting the church and local law enforcement against one another, but instead allowing us to strengthen those bonds that we have outside of the confessional to be able to work with local law enforcement to address instances of child abuse or domestic abuse in general.
And to protect the vulnerable. Thank you so much for this analysis,
Absolutely.
and we'll be watching this carefully.
Thanks, Montse.